Talking today with Dr. Vaughn Mancha, who is kind of an expert on the field of epigenetics, and he's got a group on Facebook where he shares a lot of stuff, and also a few videos on YouTube that we'll probably put in the description later. But wanted to have a chat with him about some of the ways that we can look at the biblical story with an eye for the influence of epigenetics. So how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine.
And you just sent me a little article that was pretty interesting. I couldn't read the whole thing, but I read the abstract about basically how people who get married and stay married are healthier epigenetically than people who are getting divorced and remarried and things like that. Is that?
Yeah, that's true. And in fact, they also noted that single ladies, after going through divorce and just staying divorced, were not living as long as a special subgroup, which is rather interesting. My wife said, gee, I don't know, marriage is really hard. She couldn't quite believe it. But it's a fascinating study. It's based on this concept of what's called the epigenetic clock. And in evolution, they had developed what's called the molecular clock, where they tried to guess that mutations occurred a certain amount over time. And they thought that they were rather constant. However, that's all being completely upturned. Molecular clocks aren't constant, especially when you look at periods like the Cambrian explosion. You know, all that stuff occurred. It wasn't a constant rate. And but nevertheless, when they started studying the epigenetics, and by the way, epigenetics is kind of what the word sounds like. Epi meaning above the gene. It's a coding on the DNA that makes it do what it does. And it's a completely different way of looking at things. We used to think that we are what our genes were and that we were pretty much predestined to it. Epigenetics plays the DNA in a specific way to make things happen. They're able to study over time from when we're born until we're older that epigenetic mishaps increase, and it increases at a pretty constant rate. And they're calling this the epigenetic clock. And they're able to use that epigenetic clock in a number of different fields, like everything from PTSD to mental health. But they applied it in the case of marriage, which is phenomenal. You know, we would never have been able to guess from a Darwinian standpoint something like marriage is affecting our DNA. I mean, it's outside of the whole concept of neo-Darwinism. But epigenetics, in fact, does. Now, I don't put 100% in this article, but I think that it probably hits on something. So that's why I thought it was really a fascinating article to actually show something like this. Anyway, that's all pretty much I have to say about that particular article.
Yeah, and I know that from the things that you've posted that, you know, you really understand this on like the, you know, the level of the genes and the really complicated stuff that's going on there. But you know, I've noticed like in a more big picture way, where even like I don't know, are you familiar with Jordan Peterson? Yeah. So, you know, he did this whole thing where he's reading you know, he did all these lectures on the Bible, and he's kind of looking at it through a lens of evolutionary psychology. And, you know, this is a thing that people do. They just kind of take like the big picture principle of like Darwinism and then just apply it to all this other stuff. And it seems like from everything that I've read, you know, and everything that you've shared in your group, like that really the Lamarckian epigenetic lens is probably a better way to look at things, even not just on the specific level, but like, you know, this kind of idea that we have of like natural selection where just, you know, which natural selection is favoring the few and causing many, species to be extinct, whereas really, the epigenetics almost goes back to the way that people originally conceptualized Darwinism, where you could imagine visual changes, noticeable things over a shorter period of time due to environmental differences and things like that. And it doesn't necessarily, we would still, dig up some fossils that don't look exactly like the animals today, but in saying that they're extinct, it doesn't mean it's like this whole, species of animals was just wiped out. It's just more likely that their descendants changed over the next several generations, and so there's not as much death and destruction necessarily. It's a more efficient mechanism for change. Would you say that's?
Well, Lamarckian epigenetics, and Lamarck lived 50 years before Darwin, and his ideas were the main ones. He was the first one to actually propose a theory of evolution, and he coined the word biology, which we all follow today. But Darwin took over rather quickly. Mainly philosophically, people enjoyed the idea of there is no creator, and this can all happen by random chance. Now, Darwin hit a real wall in 1900 when they rediscovered Mendel's work. I mean, Darwin didn't do the first experiment. I mean, if he were to submit The Origin of Species today to any journal in this world, they would outright reject it. It was all based upon inference. It was very clever, and it was well thought out for what he had in that day, and I don't fault him for that. What I fault are the people that ran with it and then tried to cram the biology into it when it really wasn't working. So when Mendel, on the other hand, did 2,500 experiments, he had every friar around the area he was in helping him out with plants, and he had validated studies. But he didn't have the cheering group like Darwin did. The English have the great cheering group. Look at Newton. Newton had the great cheering group, and everyone wanted to say that his calculus, that he originated it, when it's really Leibniz of Germany that made the calculus that we use today. Newton's was horrible. And I read an article that said that it held back England 10 years trying to use that versus Leibniz version. And so this is just the pattern of historical history and how things unfold. Now, interestingly, Darwin was a fan of Lamarck. He quoted him at least 12 times in his Origin of Species. And he came up with a theory that was absolutely brilliant. The most brilliant thing that he really came up with was this idea that particles would travel throughout our body down to the gametes. And the neo-Darwinists just completely said that's the worst mistake you've ever made. We are discovering, however, that they are these things called exosomes, like little bubbles that come out of our cells, and they move all around our bodies and through our bacteria and the microbiome. He was actually correct in that one thing, probably the most correct thing he did. Also, in his later life, by the time the 6th edition of Origin came out, he was really leaning on Lamarck a lot more at that point. The mistake came along when the gentleman that originated neo-Darwinism, his name is Adolf Weismann, a German brilliant embryologist who separated the idea of our soma, or our bodies, from our seed. And he called it the Weismann barrier. He basically said that nothing that happens to our bodies can go to our seed. And believe it or not, for 60 years, how many years? 110 years, people believe that. There's some that still believe that. And basically it was written to discount Lamarck, because Lamarck's main contention was that when we encounter the environment, everything we see and everything we do winds up influencing our offspring. And because the neo-Darwinists were focused on DNA only. They could not conceive how the DNA in the seed could ever change from the environment per se, other than just mutations and luck. But epigenetics, these little tags on top of the DNA, do go from generation to generation, and they respond to the environment. So it's a completely different way of looking at things. And this has gotten a lot of this idea has hit the modern day biologists so hard that at least 40% of them doubt neo-Darwinism at this point. They don't say it out loud. They'll say it over a beer, but they realize it's wrong. The biggest thing that's come out too is megagenomics. We have these machines that look about the size of a big copier. They're cheap now, and they can pattern the DNA in a specimen, and people are typing DNA from every form of life around the earth. And then once they get it in, they put in these databases, and people can access it and compare it and come to conclusions. And basically neo-Darwinism flew out the door for at least these last 20 years as this information's been coming out. That doesn't stop them from trying to conclude Darwinism is right. And here's how they do it. Going back to the molecular clock idea, correct? They assume the mutations were just random. By the way, when mutations occur, it occurs in the DNA when it's repairing itself. There's at least 5 different mechanisms, and every one of those mechanisms is guided by epigenetics purposefully. For instance, some of you might be holding your head right now with wanting a wet towel around it from some of the things I'm saying. When you study, the oxygen level are higher in your brain, and it purposely causes DNA double-strand breaks in the neurons. And then the epigenetic heals it and creates a new tag, which creates memory. It's directed mutation with the purpose. It's not random mutation per Darwin. So, we're learning all this stuff that is just absolutely outside the, when I took biology in college, getting ready for my pre-med, it was in the late 70s, and Darwin was absolutely untouchable. It was like, if you didn't believe that, you didn't believe the theory of gravity. And that was the stuff I was hearing. I realized looking at the DNA that it was too complex to be explained by that, but I didn't say anything. I just wanted to get out of there and get my grade. And, so I'd reverberate everything they said. But now, gosh, if I was in school now, I could just give them article after article, which you've seen on my post. It would blow apart everything he said. The teacher would cover, he'd say, no, I'm going to kill him with an article. So it's rather exciting time. And what's so exciting about this is we're not talking about the old creationist arguments or even the intelligent design arguments. For the most part, they were all dismissed anyhow. We're talking about 120,000 articles that have come out on epigenetics in the last 10 years, and it's undeniable. People cannot dismiss it. The biologists are being convinced themselves by the data, not by some argument of a creationist here or there. And that's what I find exciting, because they're self-correcting to some extent. A lot of them are slowly self-correcting. Getting back to the molecular clock, if you know that there's a certain rate of mutations, there was a gentleman by the name of Moto Kimura, who was my hero actually in college. He came out with what's called the neutral theory of evolution. He concluded that the vast majority of mutations were neutral. They had no positive selective benefit per Darwin. And this caused the Darwinians to go nuts. But he was correct. He was showing that this was truly the case. And the reason it was working was because epigenetics is not pro-positive selection either. And he didn't realize what epigenetics was, but it fits hand in glove with epigenetics. What neo-Darwinists did was they took the molecular clock neutral theory that Kimura said, and they said, okay, if we know that maybe one mutation happens every 5 minutes, then if 3 mutations occurs, that must be an indication of positive selection or natural selection. Natural selection may happen quicker, right? Or if there's less, say just 1, then that's negative selection or purifying selection. You see how simple mathematically that could be. And there's just tons of articles where they apply that basic ratio to say it's positive selection or negative selection. Every which way it goes, it's selection. Sometimes it's neutral, in which case they say, well, that's not threatening to us anyway. However, now we know the molecular clock is wrong and that it's an epigenetic clock, then that whole concept is gone. You can't do these population studies and count mutations and claim natural selection or purifying selection or any of these things. Therefore, all their phylogeny trees that they've been doing for the last 50 years based on these ideas are wrong. It's astounding. I mean, it's fundamentally shaking the foundations of molecular biology and biology. So it's a fun ride right now. I'm just enjoying it. But getting back to epigenetics, what's fascinating about epigenetics and is they're able to take a regular body cell and turn it back into a primordial germ cell by rearranging the epigenetics and stripping them off in a certain fashion. So this is completely, again, disproving neo-Darwinian thoughts. You know, neo-Darwinian thoughts, the mutations occur and they accumulate and they keep accumulating. You can't reverse them. In this case, because you can reverse epigenetic tags, you can revert to a particular state. And if you notice, every time one organism goes sexually reproduces to the next, it starts off with a whole new set and it's primordial and it doesn't have all the many epigenetic tags. And over its lifetime, it accumulates epigenetics. Now, you might say, well, why then do we pass on bad epigenetics? Aren't they all stripped off? Not all of them are stripped off. Maybe 5% remain, and they reconstitute a lot of the things, and some of them can be very bad. And I saw in your talk that you discussed the sins of the father, and I think I sent you that article in Nature Journal talking about the sins of the father. So there are certain things, like when a woman's pregnant, and they first discovered the first study of epigenetics in humans was done during the Nazi occupation in Denmark. The Danish doctors were really sharp. They were very good record keepers. They were all the data they kept and descriptions of things. They couldn't do anything about it, but they sure could record it.
Yeah.
So they knew exactly whether a child was born after the occupation or before the end of the occupation. And depending on how much food the woman had access to, determined the outcome of the child. If after the occupation was over and the woman pigged out while she was her last trimester, the child would grow up with diabetes. On the other hand, if the child was born during the occupation and the mother was starving, the child could have more mental illnesses, including schizophrenia and ill health. And that was the first indication in humans. Keep in mind, to do an epigenetic study over several generations takes a long period of time. And that was the first one, and we just had that data, if you will. Now, when they use, worms and bacteria and other things like that, we can get many, generations. But all these studies are coming out that epigenetic trends pass on. I think you touched on Exodus 20, didn't you? In the Ten Commandments in your talk.
Yeah, I think. Well, and I know you had mentioned that in the other video, because I watched your one with Eric Hovind prior a while ago, and then before I think I did mine, and I did a couple of things that kind of touched on the epigenetic thing, and that was really some of what I wanted to talk to you about, because I'm kind of doing some particular little research in the Bible, and I want to. I'm like, I think I understand it, but I just want to make sure I'm hearing it from you, and especially so like you were saying about how the barrier between the sperm or whatever, the body and
the Weismann barrier,
the Weismann barrier, and that now we know that lived experiences to a certain extent are passed on, and I think that's especially that's the way that fathers pass on that information to their children.
Well, and let me touch on that. There's a difference between the sperm and the ovum as far as epigenetic tags.
Yeah.
If you think about it, the ovum goes into The ovum occurs in the woman when she's still a fetus in her mother. So, and it freezes basically. This is why you have, if you wait too late in life to have a child, like in your late 30s, you can wind up with Down syndrome, because that ovum is very, very old, whereas the male is producing every 2 weeks. But also because of that factor, there's a whole series of factors which predispose him to having more epigenetic errors, in fact, which goes right along with the sins of the father concept.
Right. Yeah. And that, I think we had chatted not at a previous time, and I was asking you a little about that with the eggs, like, because like, Adam and Eve are in the garden and they both eat the fruit. So they're both affected, but Eve as a fully grown woman would have eggs that would basically be unaffected by most of that change, or, whatever the change of, and I think that whole, I haven't really done all the writing up of it, but I think, if you look at that kind of whole scenario, all of those things are probably not just, whatever effects they had from eating that fruit, but their willfulness, their, the man blaming the woman, these are all kind of things that probably get passed on. And, some perhaps developmentally, just from children observing their parents, but to a certain extent, some of it could be passed along through the epigenetic.
Well, that's a good point. And PTSD or stress is definitely strongly passed on. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this to you, but in the garden, the first thing that God, when he came back after they had fallen, he came into the garden, asked where they were, and they were in the bushes covered with fig leaves. And he said, "Why are you covered with fig leaves?" It's because we were naked. And then the first question was, "Who told you you were naked? And who would that be?" And we don't know basically how long Satan was with them after they fell. He could have been with them 50 years. And the whole time he would have harangued them to the fact that they are no longer able to be in front of a holy God because they're fallen now. That he could have induced incredible stress on them psychologically. And that could have been what is kind of passed on through the child. If you think about it, the children scream. The first thing they do, they're totally afraid. If they could get a knife, they would kill you to get what they want. They're in a primitive, dangerous state. And PTSD, in essence, may be the main thing that's passed on. Who knows? But that's my guess on it.
And so then the other thing that I was really thinking about that in regards to is there's so much pattern in the Old Testament, of not the first son being, God's chosen, but often it's, the second son or sometimes the youngest son, like David was the youngest son, and even like Isaac was, born to Abraham and Sarah when they were both very old, which, there's some health, like you said, like things like Down syndrome and stuff, like there's some health consequences that we don't necessarily suggest that as like the healthiest physically, but as far as, all of that other life experience does in some way kind of get passed on.
Yeah. Well, as far as Isaac, there are definite, and I've read many studies where they're studying the epigenetics of the older male, his sperm, everything, and they do have a lot more problems that are predisposing to health issues. Now, I don't know how that affected Isaac or not. One of the things you have to think about is, Abraham is not too far off from Noah in that group.
Yeah.
And they had what's called a founder effect that we see, say, in Alaska in a fish hatchery. When you get a large group down to a small group, they start to age quicker. And, as you recall, right afterwards, the ages would drop down almost, 100 years at a time. And Abraham lived to 250 years. So for him to have had sex at 99 years of age really wasn't that big an issue.
Right.
From our perspective, we think that's a big deal, but it was midlife for him. So I think that has to be taken into account.
Yeah. So so I was saying, like, I mean, that's why, some people would say, oh, like, we shouldn't necessarily suggest, geriatric people having babies or whatever. But I was just thinking about this from like God's perspective of, like where David, he's got like whatever it is, 7 older brothers,
Yeah.
and each, with each successive child, that his father has learned something, has changed in some way. And I mean, I was even thinking
Oh,
about
yeah.
this just in the regard to like my own kids. I have two daughters, and the our first child is a lot more willful than our second child. But our second child, when we conceived her, we were already parents. That was a very, very life-changing effect on my wife and I, in our demeanor and all these things. And so, I mean, and some of that, like I say, there's certainly some just developmental changes from, as with younger
Yeah.
kids looking up at their older siblings. But
what you're talking about is there's a lot of balls in the air on this
yeah,
whole issue. But what's amazing about this is the whole field of psychiatry had nothing on genetics to do. They had nothing to do with genetics because, as far as they could tell, the genes didn't change based on the behavior. They were bereft of any data, if you will. The same thing with psychiatry. Now, however, they can, as we start to, say, for instance, let's study your family. Say a psychologist draws tubes of blood, checks for certain epigenetics profiles on your children and you and their behaviors. They'll, for the first time, be able to kind of, line up some things. We've never had that before.
mm-hmm.
And I'm looking for, and for instance, the paper I first gave you was an example of that, So, but I mean, there's a lot of variables. It's hard to do these studies when there's so many variables, but it's coming out. And in fact, as one of the benefits, they were studying warriors of the last Gulf War and everything who had committed suicide, and they were actually able to get a test, an epigenetic test, which was about 65% accurate as to the predictive value, which is huge, really. I mean, you still got 30-something%, but still, you got at least a better than a coin flip to tell them that they might, and you can start working on avoiding that.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And the other, well, so, and this was another scenario I was thinking that was relating to that too, when David sins with Bathsheba, that's for David a very low point in his behavior, and of course that child that's conceived doesn't live, which we're I can say like, oh, that's for the best, but God said that was what God chose, and he does know best. And then Solomon is conceived after David has repented, and he's like those two different Davids, are very different people. And so
I understand what you're talking about in those decision points.
Yeah.
Those would be almost impossible to tell without trying to study it. And it's just as likely that Bathsheba had an egg that wasn't maturated and the child was born with trisomy or something, and it was, but we get into observer bias in those sort of situations. Solomon, on the other hand, and now there is something that they're actually starting to show. They're showing that studies in certain ways are leading towards pointing out autistic people. And there's a high percentage of autistic people in Jewish populations. And as you know, they're just smart as can be. The Jewish people as a group win 20% of the Nobel Prizes, and they're only 2% of the whole world's population. And that might be related to that high functioning autism that they have. Bill Gates and folks like that have it. And it may be that Solomon was one of those high functional autistic genius polymaths, Now, it might have been that it was just a pure gift from God when he heard Solomon's prayer, but it seems to me that God unwinds things in such a way that they kind of overlap. They're both going on at the same time. So, I mean, it's amazing to me. I like to invest in everything. And Solomon in Ecclesiastes 11, verses 1 through 4, lays out all of economic theory in 4 verses. Absolutely how to invest. It's unbelievable. And if people started doing that when they're in their 20s, which he's recommending because his audience is to the young person, there would be nobody who wasn't a millionaire by the time they retired. It's amazing to, I'll post, I do a lot of Quora. I don't know if you've ever seen Quora. A lot of people ask questions, and I'll put that verse in a while there, and man, people love it. They eat it up because it's so straightforward. It's exactly what Warren Buffett and folks like that do. So his genius was just amazing.
Interesting. Yeah, I know it's obviously, it's like stuff like that, we can't necessarily say for sure how this was, but I think it is just interesting that the possibilities of looking back, even in the biblical text and seeing how like things like that could be affected by these different factors. The more we learn, and I mean, to me, it just speaks to the fact that, we believe the Bible is true. Well, if something's true, the more you learn about other things, you can, the more truth you gain in another area, it shouldn't contradict, the things the Bible says. And so, to me, it's exciting just to think of, how, and I think this is kind of my, a little bit of frustration because I've talked to a lot of people who are pretty intellectually minded in the Christian community, and they want to kind of, maybe because they're not experts or they don't realize the doubt that's happening in the high end of biology. They're going to places like Biologos and thinking that like this is a sophisticated approach to reconciling science in the Bible. And personally, I think Biologos is an awful website.
I'm going to inject on that, right?
Yeah.
I've been to certain Christian creationist websites, and I'm talking about creationist websites, and they'll put pictures in there, and to try to hide from the fact that they don't have the facts, and the pictures are kind of nice. I saw a Biologos article. I could not believe at what an elementary level it was. And what was fascinating to me was they actually, one of the things that, they upheld the concept of abiogenesis, that it all just came out of the dirt. We went from chemistry to biochemistry. In this article, they basically recited neo-Darwinism, but then they said, maybe chemicals did come by God and we just can't figure it out. I could not believe that. I was like, what? They've been saying this since their beginning. And then they popped that statement out. And I grabbed that in a second on my group. And what was funny was really, who did that to them? It was intelligent design folks. They hammered it. And that's one thing they are good at hammering. That's abiogenesis and life coming from nothing. And so for them to admit that, what's really particularly sad, though, for me is I've been a faithful follower of William and Craig for a number of years, and I have seen him debate against biology. He debated Francis Iola, who's like got 700 articles, supporting biology. He's an ex-Catholic priest and a brilliant man. I saw him debate against him, and his position was he was defending the intelligent design position. And I've talked to a lady who talked to me at one of his classes. He said, I'm not an evolutionist. So I wound up joining a reasonable faith meeting. And they played this passage that he read from Romans. And William and Craig's conclusion, which I agree with, is that nature can make us without excuse, and it can lead us to the gospel. And that's Romans 1. 25 it is, where it said his divine nature is so evident that you're without excuse. And then this old guy raised his hand in the back and said, now, wait a minute, what about evolution? That takes away the self-evidence of God in nature. So they will be with excuse. And he was just kind of like, mic drop. And that's like, so I did a follow-up on their website and sent that in. Are you, not going to support that? And I didn't, this guy emailed me and said, your question is at the top of the list. We'll let you know. And nothing happened. I was going through the Bible the other day, and I was in the Psalms 104. By the way, Psalms 104 actually described the fossil record before anyone else did. It talks about how things die off and that God would send the Holy Spirit to refurbish the earth in a cycle. But it also says, look at all the things you've made skillfully, O Lord. Your hand is in it. Is it not evident? And that verse I found extremely helpful or extremely handy when dealing with theistic evolutionists. I say, show me how his hand is in evolution when this verse says this. They want to hold on to the common threads of Christianity, believing in Christ and other things like that. So it's okay to have miracles on those things, but to have miracles in nature is not okay. What's so sad, though, is you've read that statement on Darwin versus Lamark, my group, and it talks about all the biologists are losing faith in Darwin, and they are losing their faith, and William Lane Craig is running in the opposite direction. Yeah, I find that very sad. He's going the wrong way. All he had to do is hang out for another couple of years, and it'll be up to 80% doubt Darwin. I mean, he has the arguments more than ever. Now, I would say that the biggest thing currently, and I don't know the answer to this myself, is there are the things that are very old. There's parts of our DNA that have not changed for 1 billion years, no evolution. And there are things called ultra conserved elements in the DNA. They sit in front of the genes that code things. And you can find them in all forms of life identical. I mean, we're talking 100% identical between us and a mouse. So you get to the parsimonious argument of, well, doesn't that mean that we came from a common ancestor that split off from us to a mouse? Well, you can make that argument. And I would say that's the strongest argument they have. But the problem is when you do these phylogenetic studies, everything began at the same time. There's no precursors. It was just there. So the common design argument is also there. So you may want to say, well, I want to believe in common ancestry, but if you say common ancestry with common design, then that's a better position than to just say common ancestry alone. And I might also say maybe better than to say just common design alone, because there are a lot of things we have to think about. I'm not really threatened by the idea of common ancestry myself, because I believe that God intervenes to create certain things. I mean, I'm actually one of these people who believes Adam had a belly button, but does that but these things are not, you can't work them out. Let me see, where were we?
You're saying you believe that Adam had a belly button?
Yeah. Well, I think it's likely. And if you look at Genesis, it says he was not made in the garden. He came from outside the garden. And this is not inconsistent with some scientific theories that man came out of Africa. And it's possible. And if you look at the last Adam, Jesus, he was made by two things. He was made by the seed of the woman, but he was also made by a supernaturally produced aspect of what would be the seed from the Holy Spirit to be a different individual. And it's possible that Adam was made the same way. I don't know. I've not heard of any theologian agrees with something like that. It would explain a lot to me, though. For instance, it says in Genesis 2, Adam was made from the dust of the earth. Well, if you do a search on the word dust, everyone's made from the dust of the earth. So that's just symbolic of the way you use dust. We come from the dust and we return to the dust. That doesn't necessarily mean he was made from actual dirt. Well, ultimately he was. But now Eve, on the other hand, is definitely a supernatural thing. But I think I may have mentioned before, what's the interesting thing about Eve? She came from the side or rib. And where do the stem cells in the body reside? In the ribs. So, we're talking about pluripotent cells that were used to form her. Okay, we're going back to that. No, actually, we're not. I already covered that. So that's just my offside. Now, to me, that actually protects me in a way from the common ancestry argument, because it's possible that we go, life is like a big bang in the very beginning, where the different fields of things come along, the bacteria, eukaryotes, and others, and they cannot figure out anything before that. Darwin's tree is unobtainable. And it's not that they don't want to, obtain it. They do. They want to desperately. One of the problems, the problem that it can't be done is because DNA will transfer and jump between cells, between bacteria and prokaryotes, ourselves. It's called transposable elements. And it's almost viral-like. Our bodies are made of this stuff. 50% of it is made of, and they used to call it junk DNA. The thing is it goes in there and rewires the rest of the cells. And not only that, but its biggest function is it gives the correct curvature of the DNA in the cell so that it won't break down. So junk DNA was necessary. Now, for people who want to argue from the common ancestry point of view, they'll say, well, junk DNA came along millions and millions of years ago. And because they don't code for proteins, according to Darwin, you have to code for protein to have a better phenotype and a better body. It's junk DNA. And Richard Dawkins popularized this and ruined a whole generation of biologists by a book called The Selfish Gene, that our DNA was just selfish. 98% of it was selfish, had no real reason other than to duplicate itself. Now we realize it was selfish for a reason. So if you want to believe in common ancestry, you have to admit that this stuff that came along millions and millions of years ago was anticipating an event millions and millions in the future. And evolution doesn't do that. Evolution doesn't see the future. It only sees now. It's a problem. This is a problem for the evolutionists as well as creationists, this whole thing. And it's sorting itself out right now. So I'm just fascinated to watch it unfold, really.
Okay, well, unfortunately, my kids just woke up, so I'm gonna have to get off here. But this was a really good talk, and I'm hopefully we can do this again, because there's definitely a lot more kind of exploratory thinking, that can we can do there. And I'll point people to, I guess, is the Facebook group like the best place maybe for people to find stuff?
Yeah. I read just a ton every day.
Yeah.
And I post it on there. As you can see, it's just way too much almost. But Darwin versus Lamarck.
Right.
And you can just join in, or you can Facebook friend me, Vaughn Mancha, and private message me if you want.
And I think I know a few other people that may want to talk to you. Some people are kind of exploring similar ideas and things. So thanks for your time. It was really good to talk to you.
Enjoyed it.
We'll do it again.
Right. Okay. All right. Bye-bye now.